The words landed sharper than the polished smile they were wrapped in. Joel Osteen leaned slightly forward at the pulpit, his voice amplified across the vast stadium-like church, broadcast through cameras and microphones that reached millions. Chuck Norris may know how to fight. He paused just long enough for the tension to build. But this is the Lord's house, not his dojo. The line carried a calculated rhythm, designed to sound playful, but edged with condescension. Laughter rippled through parts of the audience, the kind of laugh that people give when they aren't sure if they should, hesitant, testing the social air before committing. Others didn't laugh at all. A hush cut through the space, pockets of silence heavy enough to make the sound techs glance nervously at their boards. The camera operators, trained to catch the pulse of the room, instinctively turned their lenses toward the man sitting quietly in the lower section. The image appeared on giant side screens. Chuck Norris, arms folded loosely, posture relaxed, dressed simply in a dark shirt and jeans. No spotlight, no stage presence forced on him. Yet the room seemed to bend toward him the moment his face appeared larger than life above the congregation. He didn't move. He didn't smile. His eyes, steady and unreadable, were fixed on Osteen. That single look shifted the air. Osteen, still holding the pulpit with both hands, tilted his head, playing off the silence. He chuckled softly, a televangelist's reflex, expecting the room to follow him again. Some did, but the cameras didn't let go of Norris. And in that refusal, the weight of the moment grew. The building itself seemed complicit in the drama. The megachurch had been designed to awe, rows of curved seating climbing into shadow, massive screens, polished glass panels glinting under artificial light. Normally, the scale worked in Osteen's favor, magnifying his charm, turning his optimism into something stadium-sized. But tonight, it magnified the pause. The tension didn't disperse, it spread like smoke. A woman in the third row shifted uncomfortably, whispering to her husband. A group of teenagers in the balcony nudged one another, phones raised high, streaming live as though this wasn't a sermon anymore, but a prize fight. Osteen straightened, trying to reel the moment back under his control. "Friends," he said warmly, the corners of his smile holding steady. "You know me. I like to have fun. I love a good laugh." He gestured toward Norris. "Even our action heroes need a little reminder now, and then that God's love is bigger than any roundhouse kick." The joke landed softer this time. A few chuckles, scattered applause, but no surge. The silence that followed was different now, more pointed. Because Norris still hadn't reacted. There is a kind of silence that unnerves more than shouting. The silence of someone who refuses to play the part written for them. That was the silence Norris carried. His stillness was not passive, it was deliberate. And the congregation, though thousands strong, leaned into it, drawn like moths to the absence of flame. The director in the production booth whispered sharply to a cameraman, "Stay on him, stay on Chuck." The lens zoomed closer. Norris's face filled the screen, every line earned, every shadow across his jaw carved deeper by the stage light. He didn't blink. Osteen sensed it now. He cleared his throat, forced another smile, but his fingers drummed once against the wood of the pulpit. Small tells betray more than words. In the back rows, a man muttered under his breath, "This doesn't feel right." A few nodded, shifting in their seats. The power dynamic in the room, normally a smooth performance of applause, laughter, and amen, was beginning to fracture. And still Norris sat. He hadn't come to make a scene. He hadn't stood, hadn't spoken, hadn't moved a muscle beyond that gaze. Yet the balance was tilting. The people who laughed were now quieter, glancing sideways at one another. The people who stayed silent held their breath longer. The children who had never seen him outside of a television screen whispered his name like it belonged to someone out of time. Half myth, half man, suddenly very real in the seat just a few feet from them. A woman 2 rows back pressed her hand against her chest, whispering, "Lord, help us." Not in fear of violence, but in recognition of tension too sharp to ignore. Osteen tried to continue, shifting into the rhythm he knew by heart. Talk of blessings, of joy, of God's plan to prosper. But the words slid thinly over the congregation now, like paint over glass. Nobody was listening. Not fully. Not with Norris's eyes burning a line through the stage. The silence after Osteen's quips wasn't empty anymore. It was full, heavy, waiting. And in that waiting, Something irreversible took root. Just wondering, where are you watching from? Write it down, Bello. Osteen sensed the weight in the room slipping from his hands, and he did what he always did when the air grew uncertain. He leaned harder into his charm. He adjusted his jacket, smiled broadly, and let his voice rise with practiced warmth. You know, he said, scanning the crowd. Some people spend too much time living in the past. They rehearse their memories until they forget to live their miracle today. He let the line hang, then added, We honor yesterday, but we don't stay there. It earned a splash of applause, thin and scattered, like rain hitting pavement. The sound didn't swell, it evaporated quickly. He gestured grandly, smiling wider, but the weight in the room didn't return. The production booth cued a soft organ note to smooth the edges, the way it always did when transitions needed padding. But even the music felt nervous, misplaced. Osteen pressed on. And listen, I love our heroes, he said, palms open in a gesture of generosity. But God isn't impressed by black belts. He's impressed by believing hearts. His smile sharpened toward a laugh, waiting for one to echo back. Only a few chuckles appeared, and they sounded wrong, short, brittle. The cameras cut between the stage and Norris. That contrast was unrelenting. Osteen's grin stretched, rehearsed, while Norris sat still, almost motionless, his eyes trained forward, unreadable. Silence began to hum like electricity through the audience. In the upper rows, a teenager lowered his phone. Is he mocking him? He asked under his breath. A woman in a floral dress clutched her purse tighter, her lips pressed together. 2 rows behind Norris, a man whispered, Not here. Not like this. His voice was rough with unease. The televangelist tried to reframe it, still playful, still smiling. Chuck Norris is a legend. We all know that. But legends are stories. Faith is real life. And real life happens right here. He tapped the pulpit. Right now. The words should have landed strong, but they hit flat. A few men at the front clapped hard, too hard, as if volume could substitute conviction. Farther back, others sat with crossed arms, unmoving. A boy near the aisle tugged on his father's sleeve. Why did he say dojo, Dad? The father hushed him without looking away from the stage. Cameras hunted reactions. They caught a man in a suit blinking too fast, his throat working. They found a young woman with a notebook sitting open on her lap, pages blank. They captured faces that were supposed to nod, laugh, smile, and instead held still, watching, judging. Osteen tried a softer tack. If anyone feels offended, that's not my heart, he said quickly. I just believe God's doing a new thing. We can't cling to old images if we want new blessings. His hands spread in a gesture of peace. But his smile looked labored, like a mask slipping at the edges. A murmur swelled from the back rows. One voice shouted, We love you, Joel. Another, louder, cut across it. Let him speak. The words cracked through the microphone system, audible across the stadium like church. Ushers turned their heads, then froze, unsure. The organ played louder, syrup poured over steel, trying to hide the fracture. But the fracture was already spreading. The temperature of the room shifted, not physically, but emotionally. The lights seemed harsher, the air tighter. And still Norris had not moved. That stillness grew heavier with every passing second. When his face returned to the giant screens, the audience did not laugh, did not clap. They stared. The weight of 1,000 unspoken thoughts pressed down. Osteen launched into testimony, his old safety net. Stories of miracles, promotions, healings. The cadence was smooth, polished, perfected over years. But it rang hollow now. The rhythm missed, like music played half a beat off. Every time the camera cut back to Norris, the contrast sharpened. One man rehearsed, the other silent, both speaking volumes. A choir member in white whispered to her neighbor, This doesn't feel like church. It feels like television. The neighbor nodded, eyes fixed on Norris's face, glowing cold on the screens. The organ faded away. A groaning sound rolled through the crowd, thousands shifting in their seats at once, bodies speaking what mouths held back. Then someone near the front spoke clearly, voice firm but not raised. Respect. The word cut the air like a blade. It carried across the rows, quiet but undeniable. Osteen paused mid-sentence, lips parted. His eyes flicked across the room. We always respect, he said quickly. But respect doesn't mean we stop smiling. He forced a laugh. It came out thin, strained. In the aisle, a boy held up a handmade sign. Chuck, in letters drawn for fun earlier, now hoisted without irony. His father folded his arms and stayed stone-faced. The audience shifted again, a tide changing direction. Silence settled over the church. Not emptiness, full silence, waited, alive. The kind that makes people lean forward without meaning to. The kind that makes every small sound ring loud. And then Norris moved. Just slightly. He unfolded his arms, set his palms on his knees, and stood. The movement hit the room like thunder. Nearest to him, people stepped aside instinctively, leaving a clear aisle without being asked. Dozens of phones shot up, red recording lights blinking. The organist pressed one trembling chord, then let it fade into nothing. Every camera turned. The production director whispered, "Stay on him. Don't cut away." Osteen's smile stayed fixed, but his fingers curled tight around the pulpit until his knuckles whitened. He tried to steady his voice, but it wavered at the edges. "Friends," he said, "we're not here for battles. We're here for blessings. Let's not be distracted by nostalgia." The word dropped heavy, like glass shattering on stone. A wave of murmurs rolled through the crowd, gasps, hisses, and then a refusal to be guided any further. And for one suspended moment, the room asked the same question in silence. What happens when quiet finally speaks back to the microphone? The moment Norris rose, the room held its breath. The air seemed to fold in on itself, as though thousands of lungs had forgotten their purpose. He wasn't fast, wasn't flashy. His movements were deliberate, calm, and unshaken. Each step he took toward the stage rearranged the atmosphere. People instinctively shifted out of his path, parting in silence, as if something sacred had entered their space. Phones trembled in hands. The red dots of recording lights dotted the air like fireflies, each one desperate to capture what everyone already knew was history in motion. The cameras didn't have to search. Every lens clung to him. The audience whispered without sound. Is this really happening? On stage, Joel Osteen's smile tightened. The corners pulled so hard it looked more like a mask than a grin. His hands were still clamped to the pulpit, but the whiteness of his knuckles betrayed strain. He began to speak, but the microphone caught only a shallow breath. His timing, the thing that always carried him, was gone. Norris climbed the steps one at a time. He wasn't a performer tonight. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't acknowledge the cameras. His gaze stayed fixed on Osteen, not sharp, not cruel, but steady. The kind of gaze that makes words fail before they're even spoken. When he reached the stage, the silence was total. No organ pad, no coughs, no murmurs. Just silence, so pure it rang. Osteen finally tried to break it. "Friends," he said, voice coated in syrup, "this is the Lord's house. We're here to celebrate joy, not tension." He tried to laugh softly, as though it were all a misunderstanding. The laugh died before it left his throat. Norris stood beside him, shoulders squared but relaxed. He didn't take the microphone. He didn't need to. His voice, when it came, was low but carried across the entire arena. "Joel, respect is not a performance." The words dropped like a hammer in the middle of the sanctuary. No shout, no theatrics, just 7 syllables that rearranged the room. For a heartbeat, the audience stayed frozen. Then a sound rippled through them. Not applause, not protest, but something deeper, like the collective groan of realization. Cameras zoomed on Osteen's face. His jaw shifted once, as if he wanted to fire back, but nothing formed. He blinked, trying to reclaim the rhythm, but it wasn't his anymore. The crowd's eyes had moved. They weren't on him. They were on the man beside him. A woman in the front row covered her mouth with both hands. Behind her, a young man whispered, "Did you hear that?" He said it plain. A child, barely 10, tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Why is everyone so quiet?" The mother's eyes watered as she whispered, "Because truth makes people quiet." Osteen stepped forward, forcing a smile so hard it bordered on grimace. "Well, isn't it wonderful," he said, voice cracked thin, "that even our strongest heroes find peace in this house? Amen." The amen that followed was fractured. A handful shouted, but most stayed silent. Norris didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed, calm as stone, on the man who'd mocked him minutes before. The stillness spread like contagion. You could feel it in the way people stopped shifting, stopped clearing throats, stopped moving altogether. "Joel," Norris continued, softer now, but no less clear. Faith isn't about stage lights. It isn't about crowds. It's about what you do when no one is watching. The words hung in the air, heavy as iron. This time, people reacted. A murmur swelled, low, unsettled, alive. Someone whispered, "That's it." And another echoed, "Yes." In the balcony, a group began to stand, slow, uncertain, but standing nonetheless. Osteen tried to laugh again, but it cracked. "Now, Chuck," he said, the first name rolling out too casually, too desperate. "We all know your heart. But people didn't come here for conflict. They came for inspiration." The cameras cut wide. The audience wasn't buying it. Inspiration had already stepped onto the stage, and it wasn't in a tailored suit. Norris turned his head slightly, finally letting his eyes sweep the crowd. He didn't raise his hands, didn't ask for anything. But the audience shifted with him, as if gravity had changed direction. Even the ushers, lined at the edges, looked unsure which man they were there to protect. And then he did something small but seismic. He stepped closer, not toward the microphone, but toward Osteen, their shoulders nearly aligned. The image on the giant screens was stark. One man polished, glowing under the lights, the other plain, weathered, steady. The crowd inhaled as one. For Osteen, the stage had always been safe, a pulpit his shield. Now it felt like a spotlight too bright to endure. You could see him wrestling for composure, lips shaping words he hadn't chosen yet. His eyes flicked toward the cameras, then away, betraying panic. Norris tilted his head slightly, enough to let his words carry into Osteen's ear, but also into every microphone pointed at the stage. Truth doesn't need applause. It only needs courage. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was thick, almost unbearable. The entire church seemed to lean forward, waiting to see what would happen when one man's empire of words collided with another's empire of silence. And then, slowly, the audience began to respond. Not with laughter, not with scattered applause, but with something heavier. Some bowed their heads. Some wiped their eyes. Others simply stared, unable to look away. Osteen swallowed hard, lifted the microphone closer, and prepared to speak again. But for the first time in his career, it was clear the room no longer belonged to him. The silence pressed down like a weight. You could hear the air move through lungs, the creak of a chair, even the faint buzz of the stage lights overhead. Joel Osteen adjusted his tie, forcing a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. He leaned into the microphone, desperate to puncture the tension. "I see Chuck Norris wants to preach now," he said, aiming for lightness. A few nervous laughs scattered through the hall, but most of the audience stayed still. The joke didn't land. It fell flat, leaving the quiet even sharper. The cameras, hungry for drama, zoomed in. Osteen's smile looked plastic under the harsh lights. His hand, gripping the pulpit, trembled slightly. Chuck Norris didn't move. He didn't even blink. His eyes stayed locked on Osteen's, calm but unyielding, and the contrast was brutal. One man straining to keep control, the other radiating it without trying. The first crack came not from Chuck, but from the room. Someone near the front clapped once, hard, and the sound echoed strangely in the silence. Another followed, and then a murmur. The audience was splitting, energy shifting like a tide. Osteen sensed it and tried to recover. "Friends," he said, louder, "we came here for joy, for hope, not for conflict." His tone rose too high, too fast, the warmth strained. Chuck's voice cut through him, low and steady. "Faith without integrity is just a show." The phrase landed like a strike. Not shouted, not dramatic, just undeniable. It spread through the hall like a ripple across still water. A woman covered her face, another whispered, "Amen," and in the balcony, a man muttered, "That's the truth." Osteen's mask slipped for half a second. He chuckled, brittle now, then forced a brightness back into his words. "Well, that's one way of looking at it. But let's not forget, this is the Lord's house. This is about community, about family." Chuck didn't flinch. His presence filled the stage more than any sermon could. He stepped half a pace closer, standing nearly shoulder to shoulder with Osteen. The big screens caught the image, the polished preacher in a suit beside the weathered fighter in plain clothes, two worlds colliding in silence. The crowd reacted before Osteen could. Applause broke in patches, mixed with uneasy shouts. "Respect," someone called, clear and firm. The word hit the air like a spark. A woman rose to her feet and said louder, "He's right." Others followed, some clapping, some shouting, some just watching with wide, unsettled eyes. The control Osteen usually commanded was slipping. His timing, his charisma, none of it mattered now. He leaned harder on the pulpit, eyes darting to the cameras as though they could restore authority. "Let's not let division enter this place," he said sharply. But the word division itself seemed to confirm what was already happening. Chuck finally turned his head slightly, letting his gaze move over the audience. He didn't gesture, didn't command, but the room leaned toward him anyway. His stillness drew them in more powerfully than any plea. "This place heals only if it's honest," he said. That was all, but it was enough. The silence that followed wasn't neutral anymore. It was charged, dangerous. The kind of silence that could break open into either revelation or revolt. From the balcony, a single voice shouted, "Truth." The sound bounced through the rafters and came back stronger as others repeated it. Truth. Truth. Not yet a chant, but an echo gaining weight. Osteen's smile collapsed for a heartbeat before he forced it back. His voice came tight, defensive. "We will not be shamed here." But it no longer sounded like command. It sounded like fear. Chuck's eyes stayed on him, steady and unwavering. He didn't need to move, didn't need to say another word. The next moment, the next decision, was no longer his. It belonged to the room. And the room was already choosing. The hall was no longer neutral ground. The murmur had turned into something restless, a force Osteen could feel pressing against him. His voice, once so carefully modulated, betrayed strain. "Don't be fooled by drama," he said, raising the microphone higher. "Faith is joy. Faith is victory." His cadence, usually enough to win over thousands, now bounced hollow off the walls. The audience wasn't moving with him. They were watching him struggle. Then it cracked. A woman stood up in the middle rows, her voice raw, cutting through the air without a mic. "He's saying the truth." Her words rang with more power than Osteen's last 10 sentences combined. People turned toward her, startled, then emboldened. A man near the front clapped loudly, once, twice, until the sound multiplied. Osteen tried to smile wider, but it looked pained. "Sister, we all walk in truth," he began, but his words were drowned out by others rising, by fragments of voices joining in. "Let him speak," someone shouted. Another echoed, "Respect." Then a ripple of applause surged from the balcony, rolling downward like a wave. The cameras caught Osteen's eyes darting, searching for footing he couldn't find. His shoulders squared, but the veneer of calm was slipping fast. He lifted his hand, a gesture of command, but the audience didn't yield. The energy had shifted. The crowd was no longer passive. It had become the third force in the room, and it wasn't on his side. Chuck remained still, hands relaxed, posture steady. That composure only deepened the imbalance. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded attention, yet the audience gravitated toward him as though truth itself had stepped into human form. "Don't be deceived." Osteen pressed on, louder now, verging on desperate. "This isn't about confrontation. It's about love, joy, hope." But each word he threw landed weaker than the last, while the murmurs grew stronger, overlapping, forming a texture of defiance. A teenager near the aisle stood on his seat and cupped his hands to his mouth. "We're tired of the show." His voice cracked, but the force of it made heads turn. People around him began nodding, some clapping, some simply standing as if rising broke a spell. Osteen's frustration flared. He slammed his palm against the pulpit, the sharp sound echoing in the mic. "You think this man can speak for you? He is a fighter, an actor, living in the past. I carry the word of God." The declaration boomed, but instead of applause it was met with silence heavy enough to crush the air. That silence was broken not by Chuck, but by a single sob. A woman in the front row buried her face in her hands. Cameras zoomed in and caught her shoulders trembling. The image spilled onto the giant screens, and the audience inhaled sharply as if they'd all been struck. Chuck finally spoke, low, even, the way one speaks to a single person, not thousands. "The word doesn't need a stage, Joel. It needs truth." The words didn't roar, but the crowd reacted as if they had. Applause cracked open in every section, people standing, hands clapping until palms turned red. Some cried openly. Others raised their arms, not in praise of a man, but in release, as if years of silence were being torn open in one moment. Osteen's face tightened. He tried again, shouting over the wave. "You don't understand leadership. You don't know what it means to guide millions." His voice cracked on millions, and the audience heard it. What had once sounded powerful now rang like fear. Chuck didn't raise his voice. He stepped a fraction closer, closing the gap to almost nothing, his gaze never leaving Osteen's. The cameras caught the moment in stark detail, sweat beading on Osteen's forehead, the stillness of Norris beside him. "I know what it means to stand for one truth," Chuck said quietly, "even if you stand alone." The hall froze. It was the kind of line that stops time, not because it was theatrical, but because it carried weight no lights or sound system could manufacture. For a moment, the audience wasn't clapping, wasn't shouting. They were holding their breath, suspended between two worlds. And then the release came. From the choir, seated, silent until now, one voice began to sing. A hymn, old, without accompaniment. Another joined, and another, until harmony swelled from the robes like water bursting a dam. The melody filled the hall, fragile but unstoppable. The audience followed, first in hums, then in words, voices rising uneven but powerful. The arena was no longer a stage, it was a congregation, one that didn't need a pastor's permission. Osteen stood rigid, eyes wide, watching the moment slip beyond him. He tried to raise his hand, to reclaim authority, but the sound of hundreds of voices lifted in unison drowned him out completely. The camera lingered on his face, shock, anger, disbelief, while beside him Chuck stood motionless, head slightly bowed, letting the wave of song roll through the hall. The sound grew into something larger than applause, larger than a sermon. It was rebellion and release and truth, wrapped in one unstoppable chorus. And in that storm of voices, Osteen's image, so carefully crafted for years, cracked wide open. The hymn swelled until it was no longer just music, it was judgment, it was release, it was something Joel Osteen couldn't control. His hands clutched the pulpit as if it were the last anchor left, his eyes darting across the crowd searching for loyalty. But everywhere he looked, he saw people standing, singing, some crying, some holding each other. His smile, the trademark grin that had carried him through decades of sermons and broadcasts, had vanished completely. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came. The microphone in front of him seemed useless. Every word he might have offered would have drowned under the roar of truth now pouring from the room itself. For the first time, the pastor who had built an empire on words had nothing left to say. Chuck Norris didn't step forward. He didn't raise his hands, didn't signal to the choir. He simply stood, head bowed slightly, letting the sound wash over him as though it wasn't about him at all. That was the sharpest contrast of all. One man who had built his identity on being seen, and another whose strength came from not needing the spotlight. The cameras caught faces across the auditorium. An usher with tears streaking down his cheeks, a teenager clutching his mother's hand, a group of men in suits who looked shaken in a way that had nothing to do with music. The lens lingered on Osteen, isolated now, the man who once commanded this hall reduced to silence by the very people who had come to hear him. And then Chuck moved. Slowly, quietly, he stepped back from the pulpit, turning slightly toward the crowd. He didn't need the microphone. When he spoke, the music softened on its own, as if the room wanted to hear him. "Strength isn't in the fists," he said, voice calm, carrying without effort. "It's in truth, and truth doesn't fear the light." The words weren't shouted, but they pierced sharper than any scream. The choir faltered for a moment, then surged back stronger, weaving his words into the sound as though the hymn had been waiting for them all along. Osteen lowered his head. His shoulders sagged, the fight gone. He didn't leave the stage, but he no longer stood tall behind the pulpit. He looked smaller than he ever had, swallowed by the enormity of the moment. Chuck didn't linger. He turned, stepped down from the platform, and walked toward the first row where he had been seated. The cameras followed him, but he ignored them. He sat down the same way he had risen earlier, quietly, without fanfare, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. The extraordinary, though, was everywhere else. People throughout the auditorium were on their feet, some singing, some clapping, others simply staring at the stage where Osteen remained frozen. The sound was overwhelming, But the emotional weight was heavier still. It wasn't joy. It wasn't celebration. It was the collective shock of hearing something they hadn't expected, something they hadn't been allowed to hear in so long. Truth without polish. A woman near the front broke down entirely, sobbing into her hands. A man beside her put an arm around her shoulders, and she clung to him as though she'd been carrying a weight for years that had finally cracked. In the balcony, teenagers shouted Chuck's words back down. Truth doesn't fear the light. And the echo rattled the rafters. Osteen tried once more to speak. His lips moved, but no sound carried. He reached for the microphone, but the choir's hymn rose higher, swallowing his voice before it began. He set the mic back down, eyes glassy, his empire crumbling in silence more deafening than booze could ever be. Chuck remained still, watching none of it. He didn't look at Osteen. He didn't look at the cameras. His gaze was fixed on the people, on the ordinary faces turned towards something larger than both men on stage. That was the final reversal. It wasn't about a fighter humbling a preacher or a preacher trying to defend his throne. It was about a hall full of people realizing that the truth could stand on its own. When the song finally reached its end, there was no immediate applause. Instead, a deep silence fell again, but this time it wasn't tense. It was reverent, heavy, sacred. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, people began to clap. Not wildly, not like fans at a concert, but steadily, like an acknowledgement of something undeniable. Osteen stayed at the pulpit, head lowered, beaten not by fists, but by a man who never raised his hand. Chuck sat motionless in his seat, unaffected by the ovation, as though he had never needed it. The cameras framed the last shot with merciless precision. Osteen, still and diminished behind his pulpit, and Norris, quiet, steady, unbent, surrounded by the roar of the crowd. And for everyone watching, inside that hall, in living rooms across America, on feeds already flooding the early internet, the message was clear. That night wasn't about the preacher, and it wasn't about the fighter. It was about truth, a truth too heavy to ignore.